This should not happen in Texas, magnitude 5.1, guys, but the scary part that I'll develop in this video for you is not the earthquake itself. New Madrid fault. Now you might think, what? Is Blondie crazy? What does the New Madrid fault have to do with the Texas Panhandle? Guys, it'll blow your mind.
A large earthquake has recently just taken place about an hour and a half ago. This was up here in the Texas Panhandle. I mean, this is ranch land. I mean, you know, there's just flat southern plains here north of Pampa. But a magnitude 5.0 for Texas is extremely unusual.
This shares the blueprint with one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. Magnitude 5.1 in Texas, guys. 5.1. This is extremely unusual for Texas. Normally, when we hear Texas, we're like, yeah, that's fracking. But let me make that clear. For fracking, a 5.1, that would be really considered significantly high for an induced event. Because if we're dealing with hydraulic fracking, typically induces like micro earthquakes with magnitudes under 1.0, which are imperceptible for humans, right? Of course, induced events can reach up in higher margins if operations intersect with pre-existing faults. But that area there, this is really, really weird, and it's now all over the news. So I did a little digging, and what I found is, I have to say, let's dig into this. And there was another one in Texas, by the way, 3.9, but let's focus on the 5.1 at first. This is an earthquake that even the experts can't agree on. So I did some research and digging what is going on right now there in Texas, because Texas is not supposed to shake like this. That is the unanimous consent right now. So magnitude 5.1, as you can see on the map, hit the Texas Panhandle at 5:21 this morning. Many people felt it, as far as Kansas, Oklahoma. The part that this is a 5.1, that's not what I'm questioning. That's a fact, right? But here's what is kind of weird. I spent the last few hours reading through like every article there is, every major outlet that is covering this, and not one of them agrees on how rare this actually was. So some are calling it the strongest ever recorded in the Texas Panhandle, the strongest in over 120 years. Washington Post is calling it the biggest in the region in more than 70 years. But if we look at an old National Weather Service document, there's an earthquake from 1925 that was actually bigger than this one. So which is it? What is it? What is causing this? And why can't anyone seem to agree on the basic facts of something that happened this morning in Texas? So I think the most interesting part here is that contradiction about this earthquake. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through 4 completely different explanations that scientists have floated for what's happening underground in Texas right now. And the honest answer might be the strangest of all that is really going to surprise you. So 5:21 in the morning, it's pitch black in Texas, Roberts County, way up in the Texas Panhandle, as you can see in the map, closer to the Oklahoma border actually than to any Texas city that you would recognize. This is like farmland, cattle land, stuff like this. So quake is shallow, only about 3.5 miles down, which is exactly why it traveled, the seismic waves traveled the way they did, and they were felt. So this turned out to be not just a local rumble. This thing there has reached Amarillo, Lubbock, all the way into Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Reports came from southwest Kansas, from the northern edge of Dallas. Some residents near Amarillo said they felt shaking almost 250 miles from where the ground was actually breaking. That is quite significant, right? So For example, people in the small town of Pampa described being jolted away by a sound like rolling thunder, except the thunder was coming from underneath them, not the sky like it recently did and can do in Texas, right? Lightning storms, tornadoes, hail, all of that. So by breakfast, hundreds of "did you feel it" reports were coming in to the USGS, had piled up there, lots of them. So a second, much smaller quake followed that day, by the way, later near Westbrook, hundreds of miles south. So nobody got hurt, no major damage, and yet within hours, seismologists within 3 states were suddenly, we have to say, and they still are, paying very close attention to a part of Texas that most of them they rarely think about that area. It's nothing, right? So, and here's what most people didn't realize. The Panhandle has been quietly shaking for over a century. What do I mean by that? Records actually, this is what I found, go back to 1907. So since then, researchers have logged around 20 earthquakes in that stretch of land alone. So what is going on there? What is it? So 3 of them, before today's 5.1, crossed the magnitude 5 line. One in 1925, one in 1936, and one in 1948. So 4 more got close then in 1951, 1974, and 1980. And this is where it gets generally old, we have to say. The fault system that is there, and there is one. You might be surprised about that. There's a fault system underneath of this. It's not some recent crack. We know about it. Geologists trace it back to something that is called the Amarillo Wichita uplift. The buried remains of basically a rift where the continent tried to tear itself apart and basically failed. It couldn't make it. So this is way back in a time period in the early Cambrian. So we're talking roughly 500 million years ago, long before the dinosaurs. So basically, long before anything with a spine was crawling back on land. That's what we can say. So why now? Is this the culprit? Because don't be so fast with your judgment. Remember what I said. There's 4 explanations. They'll blow your mind. So this is an ancient scar, we can say. But it's not just sitting there doing nothing. It's buried under the wheat fields that are in this area, mostly silent for millions of years at a stretch, until we can call it modern stress seems to find it again. Or does it? But the numbers don't match. The numbers don't match. So let's unpack that contradiction. Let's go back to that disagreement that I opened with, because the explanation, I have to tell you guys, is stranger than the discrepancy itself. So the 1955 quake, the one that hit magnitude 5.4, it wasn't measured by a seismograph. There wasn't one out there to measure it. I mean, who would put one there, right? Back then. Anyway, scientists sized up earthquakes by mapping where people actually felt the shaking and where damage showed up. So what they were doing, basically reconstructing the quake after the fact from letters, newspaper clippings, cracked plaster somewhere. So it might be a real number, 5.4, but it's an estimate that is built from human accounts. And so you can guess how accurate that can be, or how comparable it can be with today's numbers that we have. So this morning, 5.1 came from actual seismic instruments reading the ground in real time. So when outlets are calling it today the strongest ever recorded, they very likely mean the strongest ever measured by an instrument, not the strongest ever to occur there. Because once you separate those two categories, that confusion at least mostly clears up. It's not that the reporters are getting it wrong, it's that we're comparing a photograph to a hand-drawn sketch, so to speak, right? And asking which one's more accurate. So, but that brings us to a very uncomfortable point. The picture of Texas seismic history is a lot more blurrier than the recent headlines want to make it sound. I mentioned the 4 possible origins for today's earthquake. So now let's get into this. This is interesting. So what actually right now caused the ground to move this morning? I found 4 competing explanations for this area. And honestly, scientists haven't fully ruled out any of them yet. One we already talked about, explanation number 1, the ancient rift just woke up, right? That would make sense. This is the leading natural theory. Tectonic stress builds up slowly across the whole continent, and every few decades, it finds the weakest point in the crust and releases there. In the Panhandle, that weak point is the old, did you see that fly? Sorry. Is the old failed rift that I just mentioned. So no human activity required for that, just geology doing what geology does. It's a time scale that makes our lives look really instant, right? That these ancient faults are dealing with. Explanation 2 that anyways came to mind when you hear Texas, old oil fields from decades ago. So nobody's almost talking about this. That's also very interesting right now. We have several historical panhandle quakes in 1936, 1966, 1974, and 1980. Happened directly on top of major petroleum fields that were actually active at the time. So researchers who studied these earthquakes said those quakes may have been triggered by that old oil production. But they also admitted that the evidence is shaky, and I tell you why. Why is it shaky? Well, because the equipment back then couldn't pin down depth, which is very important, or location with any real precision. So it's a genuine open question, not a settled one. Let's go to explanation 3. That also comes to your mind, modern wastewater injection, fracking. This is that's the one most people jump to first when they hear Texas earthquake, right? Because it's been proven elsewhere. Oklahoma, parts of West Texas have documented cases where basically pumping leftover fluid from drilling for oil deep underground measurably has triggered quakes on nearby fault lines. This is a real phenomenon. This exists. We know that. But officials that are responding to this specific quake this morning, strangely, were notably cautious, saying plainly that more data is needed before anyone can draw the line here. Because 5.1, I said it at the beginning, that's quite high for fracking. So unlike the very well documented cases that we have in West Texas, earthquakes caused by fracking, this one doesn't have the same evidence yet. So now we're coming to explanation number 4. Now you might laugh. Nobody knows. And that's actually, in my opinion, the most honest answer. Sounds strange, but it is. You know, within hours of this quake, scientists quoted, or let's say what they quoted about this quake was saying exactly that determining the cause takes time, data, and careful modeling, and that stress can simply reactivate ancient faults on its own with zero help from anything on the surface. So in science, if you hear we don't know yet, it isn't a cop-out. Really, we have to give them this credit. It's usually, and in here, I think it's the most accurate sentence in the entire story. But, here's the detail that actually stopped me while I was researching this. So geologists that are studying the Amarillo-Wichita uplift have pointed out that it's structurally similar to something called the Reelfoot Rift. I bet you haven't heard about this before. If you did, let me know in the comments. That is basically the same kind of failed buried rift system that is sitting underneath, and now listen, the new Madrid region. That's the big one, the scary one, right? New Madrid Fault, where Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee meet. So that's the zone that is responsible for the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, a sequence so powerful that some contemporary accounts describe really the fact that the Mississippi River seemed to appear to run backwards briefly, turned around its flow direction. So to be clear, no scientist right now is telling us that Texas is due for a repeat of that. Nobody's predicting the next one. What they're pointing out is actually narrower and honestly more interesting than just the basic geologic ingredients of this. We have an old failed rift. It's buried deep down. It's been quiet for hundreds of millions of years. And it's the same recipe in both places. And one just happens to sit under Texas's wheat fields instead of the Mississippi River Valley. So what's next? USGS ran its forecast within hours of the quake, roughly a 2% chance of another one of this size or bigger in the coming days. Small, yeah, but not zero. So their damage model came back green because there's not many people living there, right? So serious injuries or major economic loss or something like that is considered unlikely. But again, now listen to that. That's why the size of this earthquake is so important. If we have magnitude 5.1, the Panhandle has had now like 4 of that in about 100 years. So historically, something this size was overdue by a fairly ordinary clock, I would say, if we look at that, right? Roughly once every 25 to 30 years. Push that up just half a point to 5.6. 5.5, 5.6. The odds change dramatically. Scientists estimate that the size only shows up every 50 to 100 years in this region. If you want to push it to 6.0, so you're talking about a once in 3 centuries event. So I would say the 5.1 here isn't some statistical freak accident, as we could call it. I think it's closer to a clock finally striking the hour, as we want to say. The hour that it was always going to strike. That's how I would describe it. We just didn't know exactly when, right? We never know with earthquakes. So where does that leave us? It was definitely shaking harder in the Texas Panhandle than any seismograph ever recorded. Check mark. 4 separate explanations are still technically on the table. Scientists definitely have not picked one yet. Under the entire event sits a half a billion-year-old scar in the Earth's crust that shares its blueprint with one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. So what happened there in Texas right now? It's not something impossible, right? But it's something, we have to say, that was in preparation to happen before Texas even existed. It was in the ground there already. So I will keep an eye on this for you guys. If you want to see what crazy things happen in Texas with the flooding, absolutely insane videos and images, check the video here. But when we're talking about flash flood that brings down huge boulders with it. Check out my latest image where we have from different angles videos how a out of the blue landslide / flash flood with big boulders tears through a village and buries it, destroys everything. Crazy, crazy images. Check out the video here. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.